Good morning, everybody. Hope you had a nice weekend and, oh, that's cool, and relaxed a little bit. Starting the class off with some good news today. You might know that you all did very well on the midterm, and I'm very impressed, so let's hear it for you. Yay! See, whenever I go yay, it turns on the stars for Dumbledore. Hooray for you! Anyway, yeah, it's one of the best scores on the midterm I've seen for a long time, which is great. It means that you folks are studying and taking the exam seriously and all that stuff. And it also means that I think maybe you folks are getting a little bit more used to this online format. I mean, I can certainly understand it's not the preference of anybody, but you're learning stuff, which is great. It bodes well. Last quarter was very confusing for a lot of students, but this summer it seems like you folks have a good handle on it. I posted the grades average, which was, boy, it was good. It was like a 49 or something like that was the average. And the grade range. Now, the grade letter range, I should mention, is very rough. I put that up there on the announcement. It's not, we don't assign letter grades at all at this point. It's just a chance for you to get a general sense of the type of grade you would get. But at the end, what we do is we just add up the two scores from the midterm and the final, and then see how the rest of the class did, and then assign a letter grade. And at that point, we'll also assign pluses and minuses and all that. So, you know, the letter grade that your range that you're seeing now doesn't have pluses or minuses specified, just has the A range, the B range, C range, all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, most of you did very well. If you're not happy with your grade, there were some people that struggled a little bit. Feel free to contact myself or Serena. If you'd like to go through your test the best way, well, you now have access to the test to see what you got wrong and see what the right answers were. But if you'd like to ask specific questions, I would say contact Serena first. She can help you with that. And if she has questions, then I can help you with that as well. I can also help you with study suggestions, that sort of thing. But most of you did very well, and whatever you're doing for the midterm, you should do for the final too, and you'll do well in the class. Okay, let me take a couple of seconds to see if there's any questions on the midterm exam. I'll put the chat up. Anybody have any questions on how grading is done or anything on the midterm exam? No? All right. Anything? All right. Looks like you're happy. That's great news. All righty then. Let's then continue with the material that we left off on. And I should mention something just very quickly. Oh yeah, I gotta take the silly Dumbledore beard off. Okay, just a second. Here. Okay. Yeah, today's material, which we'll start on touch, of course. God, whenever I change it back to me, I am so disappointed. All right, anyway, here we go. Let's go ahead and share screen again. Good. Yeah, so today's material is a little tricky. Today is probably the most technically intensive day of material. It's a PSYC49 class, so it's, of course I'm trying to make it as intuitive as possible, and we're here for interest and this quarter distracting ourselves from all that's going on. And we just want to be engaged in the material, and that's my goal again for this lecture, even though it will be a little bit more technical. But out of all the lectures, people sometimes struggle a little bit because we're going to get into a little neurophysiology. You're not going to have to memorize a lot of stuff. It's just the concepts are a little bit more technical than a lot of what we learned so far. But you're really smart, I know that, so I can, go through it, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I will answer them when we take our little breaks every few minutes. But let's remember where we left off. So yes, we are starting to talk about touch, and that will be, of course, material that will be on your final exam. And we introduced the issues of touch by talking a little bit about John Bramblett, this amazing blind painter who learned to paint after he had gone blind and uses his sense of refined touch in order to determine where the paint should go, to determine what paints he's using and paint mixture and all that sort of stuff. And what that led us into is the idea of how when one loses their sight, especially their sense of touch seems to be heightened. And we talked about that in the context of kind of offsetting the natural decline in touch sensitivity that occurs for all of us as we get older. Somebody who's 75 doesn't have the touch sensitivity of somebody younger, but if they're blind, it kind of offsets that a little bit. So a blind person who's 75 won't have the touch sensitivity of a sighted 75-year-old. They'll be better than that, and they'll have an offset of about 25 years, meaning they'll have the touch sensitivity of a person who's 50, which is much better. So what's going on with that? And we talked about Braille a little bit, and we talked about that the folks that are blind on campus very likely use Braille. But it is the case that these days especially, relatively few blind individuals actually use Braille. For various reasons. It's never been used by a majority of blind people, but these days it's not something that's as required as it used to be because of audiobooks and podcasts, and just allowing your computer has the ability now, of course, to read any text that's on the screen, which makes it very useful. This kind of offsetting of touch sensitivity occurs for all blind people, not just for people who read Braille. So what is going on? And here we introduce the concept of something called cross-modal plasticity. And the idea of cross-modal plasticity is that when one loses a sense, or one even has a degradation in a sense, sometimes even a minor degradation, the other senses come in and kind of compensate for that by using the parts of the brain that are now no longer used for the original sense. You'll get this. That sounded a little complicated, but you'll get this very simply. For someone like John Bramblett, his visual brain areas, there's a lot of flexibility, but largely the visual system is being processed back here, the back of his head. It's no longer getting input from his eyes. So other senses can kind of make use of that open area, that vacated area, to now allow them to compensate for the loss of sight. Okay. So for touch, for example, John Bramblett has this really refined sense of touch because he's touching paintings, he's touching paint. And so it's very likely, in fact, I imagine by now he's been in a scanning experiment or two, it's very likely that the visual parts of his brain are now used to help him enhance his sense of touch, so it compensates for his visual loss. So the idea is that the parts of the brain that were originally dedicated to the sense that is now lost are now rededicated to the other senses to help compensate for that loss. Okay, very simple. So let me talk a little bit about the research. And this isn't research on John himself, but this is research on blind individuals, all of whom show some type of cross-modal plasticity with touch since they've lost their vision. Okay, so when you and I touch something, typically what happens is we induce activity in the touch brain areas. And maybe you've learned this in other classes, but the touch brain areas for us are these little strips right on the side of the brain here. I'll show you. It's not that important that it's a specific location, but it's right there. It's highlighted right there. And if you're interested, it actually is mapped out to different body regions. So I'm trying to read this here. This part right here, which is actually, you're looking at the brain now from the front. So this is obviously a side view of the brain. If you turn the brain around and you're looking at it now from the front, this is how it's mapped out on that little strip there. And as you can see, there's a part on the top that is dedicated to when you are touched on your leg and touched on your neck. Then down here when you're touched on your nose and your face. And as you can see, the amount of brain area that's dedicated to different areas of the body's touch systems is really proportionate to how sensitive that area is to touch. Okay, so for example, you might have noticed this. You're much more sensitive to touch on your face, on your skin of your face, and on your hands than you are on your leg. There's various ways that you could demonstrate this for yourself, but you do have a more sensitive sense of touch on those areas. And the regions that are dedicated to these different areas aren't dependent on how large that area is, like my leg is much bigger than my face, right? But how sensitive that area is. So this crazy little figure right here is trying to portray how the brain dedicates the amount of its area to different body regions. Okay, so very simply, it's saying that there's a lot of area of that little strip dedicated to the face. There's a lot dedicated to the hands, but not very much dedicated to the legs and the trunk, okay? And you can see this. I'm colorblind, but whatever this part is right here, this is all face, I believe. Yeah, eyes and stuff. This is all hand, and those are disproportionately larger regions of the strip when you're talking about how big your leg is relative to your face. Again, it's not the size of the body area that determines the size of the brain area. Okay, it's instead the sensitivity, and there's lots of reasons. We want to be sensitive for our hands, and we want to be sensitive to our faces. When it comes to things like eating, our mouth is very sensitive, that sort of stuff. So that makes perfect sense. And that's true for all of us. So you just learned something about how your touch brain works if you haven't learned this before. That's true of blind people too. However, when blind people touch something like Braille or like, things that are kind of more, fine grained and detailed, they do something sighted people don't do. They recruit parts of their brains that are typically used for sight. So, if someone like John Bramblett, in touching his paintings and touching, the paint, right? Yes, he will, activate that part of the brain that is sensitive to touch, but in addition, he'll activate the part of his brain that's sensitive to sight for the rest of us. He doesn't have sight. So that part of the brain saying, hey, I'm free. Who wants to use me? Who can I help out with? And touch will say, okay, let's do this. Let's improve the sense of touch by now using this brain area to help. And so when John touches paint, okay, he's lighting up the areas that are usually dedicated to sight, which doesn't occur for those of us that are sighted, okay, for the rest of us. So how do we know this? Lots of different research. Let me tell you about some of the earliest research that was done with this. They had an older patient who had been blind all their life and had had a stroke. They had a lesion in their visual area, and after that stroke, they were able to touch things, but they lost their ability to do a good job with reading Braille. So this is an adult in their 60s, 70s who had used Braille, had been very accomplished, and then had their stroke, and their speech was fine, their movements were fine, and they could recognize many things from touch, but what they couldn't do is really do a good job with reading Braille. They struggled with reading Braille. And in fact, that visual area was the thing that was affected, and it didn't affect that little strip on the side. They were still able to determine that their faces were being touched in various areas and their hands were being touched in various areas, but they couldn't do that fine-grained discrimination. They couldn't do that sophisticated touch process that's needed for Braille. Okay, that's some early research suggesting that, when the Braille have to do this fine touch, whether it's reading Braille or touching paint like John does, okay, they are using their visual brain. These days, we don't have to wait for somebody to have a lesion in order to see which brain areas are responsible for what type of function. Now, you know a little bit about this, right? You know about fMRI. We've talked about that you can, watch a blind person go through Braille, or like John Bramblett touching paint and see that, in fact, their visual areas do light up, okay? Suggesting that they might be involved. But we can do something even more direct in testing this, And this is cool. I don't think we've talked about this before. This is one of my favorite techniques. I think this is really exciting. It's been around now for about 20 years, but it's being used more and more regularly, and it's easier to do in the lab, probably easier to do in the lab than imaging. It's a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a big, long term. It's not really that hard to understand. Basically, it just involves actually applying magnetic stimulation across the cranium to the brain. And so that's exactly what you're seeing right here. This is a transcranial magnetic stimulation device, and it can be set up in pretty much any lab. You don't need one of those, big imaging machines you see in the hospitals. These are things that you can set up in a very simple lab, and they're relatively safe. We'll talk about that in just a second. And they're very, very useful for determining what brain regions might be responsible for what type of functions, what type of experiences, what type of motor behavior. Because what they do is they create a kind of brief and weak lesion in the brain. So we're going to, by the way, abbreviate transcranial magnetic stimulation with TMS. You may have heard the term TMS devices. It's a very well-known technique now. And what it does is it induces transient lesions. What I mean by a transient lesion is it just basically breaks that part of the brain for a very brief time. Now, I should mention, it doesn't completely break it, right? It's not like somebody had a serious brain injury there. It kind of inhibits it a little bit, but enough so you can see changes in how someone behaves and how someone experiences something in perception. And it's also used for other things, by the way. You may have heard how it's used for treating depression to some degree. I think they've had some success with that. And also treating things like tinnitus. That's that ringing in the ears that you might know. Some people have. It has therapeutic potential as well. But we're going to talk about it and how it can teach us something about the brain, how it can reveal something about the brain. And I think in some ways this is as useful a tool as being able to look into the brain through fMRI or something. Because here what we're able to do is actually change how the brain is processing for a very brief period. Transient lesion means like it's just going to last for maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute or something like that. Okay? So you can imagine how useful this is. So for example, what we could do is we could swing this little kind of mouse ear device to the side of the person's head. Okay, right now it's in the back, probably near where the visual area is. But first what we're going to do is swing it around to the side of the person's head and orient it in a specific way. And there's ways of actually, making sure you're targeting the right area of the brain. And then turn it on and ask people to do things like recognize shapes in their hands. Okay, so let's see, what's a good shape? So recognizing this shape. Okay, so they close their eyes and this is put in their hand and they're asked to recognize what shape it is. Then something else comes in their hand. Yeah, here we go. This is our ball, right? And they're asked to recognize what that is. Okay, so basically just being able to recognize shapes that are being put in their hands. And it's something that's very easy to do unless that TMS device is targeted to the touch brain region. And again, that would be here for all of us, right? So we swing around the mouse ears, right? Here come the mouse ears. It's targeting this strip right here. And while before I had no problem saying, oh, that's a square, that's a rectangle, that's a sphere, that's a pyramid, right? That's a cone shape. Now, when TMS is applied to that region, right, I have a loss of shape discrimination. And that happens to everybody. That happens to everybody, right? It happens to sighted people, blind people, and it's a little disarming. It's like, oh wow, this is weird. This is something I could do before, but I can't do it anymore. And they're told about the experiment. It's they know that's going to happen, and they say you might feel a little weird, but it only is going to last for a few seconds. Don't worry. And they'll say, oh yeah, okay, I understand. This is actually affecting my ability to touch. I can't recognize things through touch. And then they turn the machine off, and within a minute or so, they do well. Okay, so anyway, that works whether you're blind or sighted. However, when it comes to more fine-grained touch, okay, if people are asked to, for example, recognize Braille, sighted folks aren't good at it, right? They don't have a lot of practice, but people who read Braille, like the 10% of the blind people, when they come in these experiments and read Braille, they can do it without a problem. And in fact, they can do it even when their strip, their touch strip, is being lesioned by TMS, okay? But they don't have a problem with Braille. Where they do have a problem with Braille is if we swing those little mouse ears behind the head, turn on the TMS device, and ask them to read Braille. And they'll say, oh my gosh, now I'm not able to do it, right? Now I can't do this, even though I've been able to do it most of my life. I can't make this fine discrimination when you're applying TMS to my areas behind my head. Okay, they lose their ability to do fine-grained discriminations this way. And this is just, it's a little technical here, but I want you to get the big picture. This is just a way to kind of now show that cross-modal plasticity is a situation in which this vacated part of the brain for the blind is rededicated to fine-grained touch to allow for Braille, for the 10% that use it, to allow for individuals who might work on mechanical devices or something if they're blind. That's kind of fine-grained touch. Or our friend John Bramblett to feel the paint. I'm sure that if you TMS'd John Bramblett's visual cortex, he would show that he would lose much of his ability to determine the puffy paint on his canvases and to discriminate the texture of oil paints in order to determine the color. Okay, so this is just a really kind of neat way. I mean, you can imagine, someday your iPhone will have TMS. I don't know if this is true, but your iPhone might have the ability, or some little device might have the ability to do a very brief TMS. And by the way, there are inexpensive ways of doing this. We have some of those devices in our department if you're interested in this type of research. There are labs that use this type of technology. It's very simple to do, and it's a way of showing what brain region is involved in possibly the basis for different types of functions. And in this case, we can do a nice job at portraying cross-modal plasticity. Okay. Cool. Let's go on now and talk about other examples that really kind of show this. And this is an interesting experiment. I really liked this experiment when I learned about it. I was writing the book. I thought it was a very, very clever way to do it because it's not going to actually use blind people. It's going to use sighted people, but it's going to blindfold them and test how cross-modal plasticity might affect them as well. Okay, so you've learned about cross-modal plasticity in the blind. Now let's look at it in the sighted. Right, so these are probably maybe juniors, seniors. I'm not sure they would do this with freshmen because it takes a lot of time and a lot of dedication. But you'd be paid, what's good money? $300 to be in this experiment. The problem is it does last a number of days, and you have to be in a room. I think they actually put them in a hospital room just so they can monitor them. And you would be blindfolded for that period of days. I think it's 5 days of visual deprivation, okay? And that's what you're seeing there. And this is a serious blindfold. This is not the sort of blindfold you might just do casually, for a demonstration. We used to, use blindfolds in our demonstration. And we have nice blindfolds that really do block out a lot. They're not just like the things that you would wear, on the airplane to help you sleep or something like that. They're nice, but this is a serious blindfold where they put cotton over your eye and then take ace bandages, and they want to make sure you have no light sensitivity whatsoever. And once that occurs, they're going to do some imaging. And they're going to, later on, just to anticipate, they are going to apply TMS. But let's talk about the imaging parts first. They're going to look at your brain, and that's what this is showing here. This is just showing MRI sort of images of the brain after the brain is, after the person is blindfolded. Okay, so they're going to use imaging techniques. And that's the first thing they're going to do. And they're going to do that, as soon as you're blindfolded to kind of get a baseline. You're not going to have any visual stimuli, but they're going to tell what the visual brain is doing at that point, even though it's not getting any input. And they're going to have you do that as you do something like a Braille test. Now, it's not exactly a Braille test, but for all intents and purposes, they're going to have you discriminate points or bumps on a piece of paper that's like a Braille thing. So they're going to ask you to determine just very quickly, how many bumps do you feel? 1, 2, 3, 4. Are they vertically oriented or are they horizontally oriented? So they're just raised dot discrimination. It's not true Braille in that it's not representing letters, but it's something that is like Braille, and you're asked to determine if there's 1 or 2 bumps, and 1, 2, or 3 bumps, and are they horizontally or vertically oriented. Okay, and they just test to see what's going on in your visual brain as you do that. Okay, not surprisingly, as I said before, this is something that the blind would show activity in their visual brain areas, but the sighted aren't going to show that, at least not initially. Okay, and then here's the less fun part of the experiment. What you're going to do is you're going to be in this room for 5 days, and each of those 5 days, you are going to be asked to actually learn Braille, 6-hour Braille lessons per day. Well, you don't have a lot of other things to do, but still, that's an intensive schedule. So there's going to be somebody there, and you're going to be asked to learn as much Braille as you can for 6 hours a day for 5 days. Okay, so maybe $300 isn't enough. Maybe you need a little bit more money. Let's give you $1,000. Is this better? Would you do it? I don't know. Okay. All right, so you have nothing else to do, so okay, you go ahead and do this. Cool. Now, there's one more thing I should mention before we continue with this. I want to make sure I put this in here. If you go through this original paper, and maybe some of you will someday, which would be very cool, you're going to see something interesting. One of the first things they mentioned is what the experience was like in being blindfolded in the hospital room for these subjects. And one of the first things the subjects mention is, yeah, it's a little uncomfortable, it's a little strange, it takes some getting used to, but they are surprised by how bland food tastes to them. Okay, this is kind of a little tangential comment here, but this is one of these demonstrations that, you're blindfolded, and even if you're blindfolded for half a day or something like that and start eating, you have your lunch or your dinner the scheduled first day, you notice, boy, food doesn't taste as vivid as it usually does. It's less flavorful, and it's a great example just of how sight plays a role in your sense of flavor. Okay. That's an aside, that's a tangent, okay? But let's come back to the main story here. You're going to have 6 hours of Braille per day, okay? And now, as you're doing that, they're going to then, I guess what they do is they then, after the 6 hours of Braille, that evening what they're going to do is ask you to redo that first kind of raised dot discrimination, which is very much like Braille, but it's not exactly Braille. It's not that important, you know that. But they just say whether it's 2 or 3 dots and whether they're vertically or horizontally oriented. You don't have to actually do Braille now, but they're wondering, of course, is your learning of Braille going to help with this? And not surprisingly, it probably will, okay? But as you're doing that discrimination test, they're going to scan you again. So you're going to be put in the scanner at the end of each day, and you're going to lay there as they look at your brain, especially your visual areas, to see now if there's activity in the visual areas as you're doing this touch discrimination test, this raised dot discrimination. That's very much like Braille. Okay, cool. So that's going to happen every evening of the 5 days. All right, and then on the last day, they're going to do something a tiny bit different. they're going to ask you, they're going to, after your 6 hours of Braille on the 5th day, they're going to look to see if the visual brain is lighting up as you touch. But then they're also going to have you come out of the imager and try the touch task again while they are actually applying transcranial magnetic stimulation. So that's different from looking at pictures of the brain. Now they're going to ask you to see if any improvement that occurred over the 5 days can actually be inhibited, can be stopped by TMSing the visual brain areas, so they basically break for that temporary time. And you know what they're after here. They're very clearly after a way to determine if, in fact, your visual, if you improve, and if that improvement is accompanied by involvement of your visual area because you've been blindfolded. So here's the results, and they're not going to be surprising to you, at least not initially. So first of all, I should say this: you do get better as you're learning Braille. Not surprisingly, at the test at the end of the day, you do better with that touch sensitivity test, the raised dot discrimination. That's very clear. The practice in Braille does transfer to the touch, and basically it's like a Braille test, so that's not surprising. But the visual brain area does increase. The involvement of the visual brain area does increase over the 5 days. So at first, they didn't see the visual areas lighting up, but after being blindfolded and going through the Braille test, the visual brain areas seem to get more and more involved over the 5-day period. Okay. In fact, it's greater than another group of subjects down the hall that had a somewhat different scenario. There was a group down the hall that was only trained on Braille. They were there for the 5 days, but they were only trained on Braille, and they were not blindfolded. And for the folks that were trained on the Braille but were not blindfolded, there's more visual involvement, more visual brain involvement. Okay, let me say that again. You're imagining yourself being blindfolded for 5 days, being subjected to the 6-hour-a-day training. Okay, and what's the involvement of the visual brain as that goes on? Clearly, it's getting more and more involved. Okay, there's another group of subjects down the hall now that weren't blindfolded, but they're also learning the Braille. They're in the hospital room. They're able to watch TV and everything. Where you have to just listen. But they are going through the training. They're going through that Braille training 6 hours a day. But their visual brains don't seem to be as involved as yours do with the touch discrimination test. Maybe a bit, but not very much at all. Okay? Now, there's one more group of subjects that's down that hallway. Okay? And they did something different from your group and the group that was not blindfolded but did get the Braille training. The group down there was blindfolded for the 5 days, but they did not go through the training of 6 hours of Braille every day. They did get tested at the end of every day, for their dot discrimination sensitivity. Was it 2 or 3 dots? Was it horizontally or vertically oriented? They are blindfolded, okay, but they are not taught Braille. So how do you think they would do? Right? They're not trained. But how do you think they would do? Well, first of all, they do almost as well as at the dot discrimination as you do, despite not being trained on Braille, which is a little odd. That's a kind of a pain to be trained on Braille 6 hours a day. How come they're able to do this dot discrimination nearly as well? And maybe even more interestingly, their visual brains act like your visual brain. Over the 5-day period, their visual brains became more and more involved in touch despite never having the Braille training. Okay? You would think that your visual brain is becoming more and more involved because you're getting 6 darn hours a day of Braille training. Okay, that's got to be part of it. And maybe it's a little part of it, but guess what? That group down there that had it much easier than your group, I hope they're not getting as much money, they didn't have to go through the 6 hours a day, but they were blindfolded. And it seems that the blindfolded only group, not trained, okay, also was able to involve their visual brains. Okay. Okay, so let me go through this one last part now. So let's remind ourselves, we're in the group that has to do everything. I'm blindfolded for 5 days and I'm learning Braille for 6 hours every day. They're not blindfolded down the hall, but they are learning Braille 6 hours a day. This group over here, interestingly, is blindfolded, but they're not learning Braille. My group, okay, does involve the visual brain as I do the touch test at the end of every day, okay. Their group does not, okay, even though they've been trained on Braille, not very much visual brain involvement. Their group, darn them, has visual brain involvement even though they didn't have to go through the stinking 6 hours a day. Cool. Finally, what happens at the end? Okay, at the end with the TMS, what's going to happen to my ability to do discrimination? As it turns out, maybe not surprisingly, okay, it is reduced during TMS. My ability to do this discrimination test that got better and better and better was nullified basically when the advantage that was provided by my visual brain being involved was TMS, was lesioned. All of a sudden, I become pretty bad again at that discrimination test, almost as bad as I was when I first started this whole 5-day experiment. So what's the take home here? This is a cool way of showing, I mean, it's a very kind of systematic way of showing that the visual deprivation, whether I have it in plus my 6 hours of intensive Braille training, or they have it who don't have intensive Braille training, it's the visual deprivation that seems to allow the visual brain areas to enhance touch discrimination. It's a little counterintuitive, right? Because you're thinking 6 hours of Braille is a lot. That's got to provide some advantage, right? That's got to, maybe involve the visual brain more and allow me to do that touch discrimination task better later on. But as long as you're blindfolded, you don't really need the intensive Braille training to have better touch skills and to have the visual brain involved. Any sort of visual deprivation over the course of some time seems to involve the visual brain to help touch. Again, the idea here is whether you're trained in Braille or not, the visual brain's looking for something to do. Say, hey, touch system, can I help you? Can I help you become a better toucher to maybe help offset this blindness? And the touch system says, sure. And even if you're not trained in Braille, it's going to enhance your sense of touch and involve the visual brain. And that's an important thing to realize. It's the deprivation that seems to make the difference. By the way, after these poor folks are done with their experiment, they take off their blindfolds, they're given their big check, they go out in the world, food tastes fine to them very soon, right? Probably immediately. And, things go back to normal in their brain. If they come back and are asked to touch again, their touch might be a tiny bit better, but their visual brain isn't going to be involved. Once the deprivation's ended, for the most part, for this type of experiment, things revert back to the way they were before. Okay, let's take a little break here and see if there's any questions. Nasim has a question. Okay, go ahead, Nasim. Please ask your question. And if anyone else has a question. Oh, okay. I'm having trouble hearing you. Hold on just a second. Go ahead, try now.
Yeah, how you doing, Professor?
Good, how are you?
Good, thanks. I have a question. I have a TBI and they affect both my eyes. So they told me probably it get fixed, probably not. And sometimes I get blind, like I couldn't see anything. And I know when you talk about this experiment, sometimes I have it for free. So I try to do my finger touch. I want to do everything. Well, sometimes I cannot read, but it's not always. It's going up and down. It's like sometimes, especially my left eye, because I have the injury in my left side. So when you talk about it, some people they take it as a joke, but it's really really tough.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that with us. That sounds pretty difficult. Have they discussed possible ways of training the visual system to help it, or ways of kind of
You know,
compensating for?
they told me the problem I have is not my eyes. I have a good eyes,
Yeah.
great eyes.
Yeah.
But what's happened is the brain system get injured when I get the TB, and it not come the same time. It's
Right.
like day by day get worse and worse and worse.
Oh,
And
really? It seems to be
but
getting worse as time goes on. Yeah.
yeah, and sometimes I couldn't see anything. Like I done. It's just my right eye see the people just like moving,
Uh-huh.
but my actual left one is done. So I
Wow, I'm
try
sorry
to
to hear
witness
that.
it, but
That's
yeah,
really tough. So
yeah.
it function. It really impedes your ability to get around and all that. Or
Normally, when I have this problem, I stay too stuck in my
yeah,
place,
yeah.
and but you know, I try to figure out what I want to do. So,
Mhm.
like, try to touch everything, try to
Mhm.
know where I go and where I'm coming,
Mhm.
and absolutely, I'm not driving for probably after that for a couple of days. I'll make sure like everything get back to normal.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Have they told you? Are the doctors familiar with this type of issue? I mean, do they know
Yeah, yeah.
about?
Actually, they did in a lot of CT scans and those put me in that machine, and they said, you know what, we cannot get inside and take the problem. It's
Yeah.
like when you hit yourself in the like in your hand, in
Mhm.
some places, and you get a bruise on it. So it's going away sometimes, and sometimes stick with you for longer.
Yeah, but there is recovery. There's often
There's a
return.
recovery,
That's good.
but how long it takes,
Yeah.
it depends on the brain.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for
Okay.
sharing that.
Oh,
Yeah,
you're
I
welcome.
hope
Thank
hope
you.
the recovery comes.
Oh, thanks, folks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a neurologist, so I can't speak to specific
No, just I
clinical
want to say because
situations.
when they do the same, like they blindfolded the people
Yeah,
and his experiments, it looks fine for a lot of, but when I heard about it, I say no, it's not. It's not
yeah,
at all.
yeah, 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 yeah. No, it'd be very unpleasant. I can completely understand that. Yeah, I don't. Have they considered using TMS as a kind of clinical intervention at all? That is something that
They,
sometimes they do. Have they talked to you about that?
they tell me about a lot of stuff,
Hmm.
and I'm lazy to go in anywhere, doctor.
Yeah,
Honestly,
I
it's going.
understand.
You know how many doctor I have to see, and
Hmm.
I told them, you know what? Let's if this gets much worse,
Hmm.
and yeah, but right now I try to work
Yeah,
it around.
yeah, I
So yeah,
understand.
okay.
Okay,
Thank you, Professor.
sure. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks for your
Yeah,
time.
yeah, no problem. It's interesting. Okay. Other questions? Anyone have other questions that I can answer about plasticity or anything? Okay, let's go ahead and do one of our polling questions here. All right. Let me see if we can answer this one. Oh, shoot. Hold on. Is that the first? Yeah, I think this will work. Yeah, okay. This should be very easy for us. We just talked about this. Um, well, we also mentioned it last class a little bit. You should have no problem, but you'll get another question for your exam. Let's go ahead and do this. Oh, sorry. I should have read it first. What is the main reason that most blind individuals have better touch sensitivity? Their use of Braille, their touch brain can be reassigned to vision, their visual brain can be reassigned to touch, or both A and B. Go ahead and take a minute or so to answer that, and we'll talk about the answer. Okay, another 15 seconds or so. No? Okay. Let's answer this. And and share the results. Okay, what is the main reason that most blind individuals have better touch sensitivity? Now, most blind individuals, remember, do not know Braille. Remember, 90% of blind individuals, maybe even more than 90% right now, don't use Braille for various reasons. So that isn't why. So the answer cannot be A, which of course means it can't be D either. Their touch brain can be reassigned to vision. It's not that their touch brain is reassigned to vision. They're not getting vision. It's that their visual brain can be reassigned to touch. So B isn't correct. C is correct. The part back here that is typically considered to be more or less responsible for visual sorts of functions, that gets reassigned to touch for individuals who are blind or blindfolded or go through some sort of visual deprivation. So the correct answer is C here. You actually don't have that in the image here, but you might want to take note of that. The actual answer is C. It is not D because A and B are not correct. Okay, I will stop sharing here. All right, any other questions before we continue? Anything else? Cool. All right, let's go ahead and share. By the way, this is, if you're interested in this image here that's behind me, it's not Hogwarts. It's I think it's Prague. Yeah, it's Prague. And when everything gets back to normal, or you're finished with college and you're doing a Europe trip, I highly recommend it. It's a really fascinating city, and it's very romantic. In fact, I got engaged there to my wife. So when you're there, you can think of me. Okay. Anyway, let's go ahead and continue with our discussion of cross-modal plasticity and talk about instances, in fact, when we might be using our visual brain area to touch in much more kind of simple circumstances than being blindfolded in a 5-day experiment. So we're going to talk about shorter term deprivation. The first thing I can tell you, and this I find absolutely fascinating, is that your visual brain areas can get involved in touch and even hearing with much shorter deprivation. In fact, if you're blindfolded for as little as 3 hours, you do find two things. First of all, you find that somebody's sense of touch becomes more sensitive, and that it does so by virtue of having the visual brain areas involved. And we did actually, this seems so strange to us when we found out about this research in the laboratory. We decided to do a little of our own experimenting on it. It was a very casual experiment. We didn't really follow it through, but we found some interesting things. We were able to replicate some known effects. We had people just sitting there for 3 hours with a blindfold on, and we wanted to keep them busy, so we talked with them and kept them kind of engaged in what they were doing, but we did not put them through any sort of touch training at all. In fact, we asked them to hold their hands on they were sitting on a chair and with arms, and they just held their hands facing up, so their hands were actually not touching anything, right? And then what we did is we tested their touch discrimination, and then we also tested their hearing, which was interesting. I don't have that on the slide, but what you find is people's touch sensitivity is improved by visual deprivation, even if they're not trained to do so. So this is very much like you learned before in that previous slide. But here it happens in 3 hours. And what we did is we tested their touch discrimination. And this is following somebody else's research. I don't want to take credit for thinking of this or anything. We tested their touch discrimination. Oh, I wish I had something like this to show you. I'll have to buy one of these next time. But it's very simple. It's a little plastic kind of nub thing here. It's about the size of your fingertip. So do I have anything around here? Oops. Sorry, hold on just a second. I don't know why that happened. Okay, sorry, hopefully everyone's seeing everything. If you're having problems, let me know. Otherwise, I'll assume everything's okay. All right, I'm trying to think if I have anything here that I can show you. Basically, it's like a little, it's kind of the size of this. I guess you'd say, kind of the size of this tip. And you put it on somebody's finger, and it has a grid on it at the bottom of it. And the job of the subject, with their eyes closed, they're blindfolded, of course, is to say whether the grid is positioned vertically on their fingertip or horizontally on their fingertip. It's a very easy thing. But what you can do is you can actually get a collection of these little grid things that you put on people's fingers, and they can have deeper or more shallow sorts of grooves in them. So sometimes it's very hard. If these were very shallow grooves, right, if the nubs weren't very big, you could imagine it would be harder to determine whether it was vertically placed on your finger or horizontally. And what we found is that people who had just been blindfolded for as little as 3 hours actually had better touch sensitivity, even though they weren't actually touching anything during that 3 hour of blindfolding. It wasn't until the end where we tested them. And these other researchers who really did the original experiment then actually tested to see if their visual brains were involved in that better touch discrimination, and they absolutely were. We also found that people were a little better at their hearing, and I'll talk more about this later on in the quarter, but they turned out to echolocate a little better after 3 hours of blindfolding. Okay, we're not exactly sure why that occurred. It could very well be, as we'll see later, that their visual brain was also rededicated temporarily to hearing. We don't have a way of establishing that, but they were a little bit better with sound as well. It's not on the slide, but I thought I'd mention that to you since you're all so smart. Okay, cool. But there's other examples where you don't even need to be blindfolded. And in fact, it could be that it's generally the case that your visual brain can help you out with touch. And so that's what I'll say here. Your visual brain helps you out with touch. And I think we have some, kind of everyday examples of this type of thing. So, one example might be, you're going home late at night, you park on the street and you're walking towards your front door, and what you might do is feel in your pocket for your keys, and you might feel for the key that you use to open the door. After a while you use keys enough, you can kind of discriminate them through touch, so you can be sure that you're pulling out your house key and not your car key or your office key or something like that. That is a kind of a fine-grained instance of touch perception, and you're kind of feeling the spatial properties of your key. Okay, so I know my house key has a little, do I have my keys here? No, but it has like a little hexagon on the top of it, and it's this long, and it has these sorts of little bumps on the probe part of the key. That's an instance of spatial touch, because you're kind of discriminating, you're kind of determining the spatial outlay of the key itself. And we know when people are asked to do that type of thing, like feeling a key in their pocket, okay, that they will actually enlist their visual brain areas a little bit. This is not being blindfolded, okay? This is just, being temporarily unable to see your key. You decide you want to do this with your key, or maybe your phone. Another example, okay? I know that when I have my phone in my pocket, okay, what I will do is I will kind of put my hand in my pocket and feel around the phone for its, little buttons and stuff like that, to know that when I pull it out, I'll be pulling it out upright rather than upside down, just to make the whole thing efficient. You get so used to touching your phone. I think a lot of us do this. You want to make sure you pull it out upright, maybe even push the button so it's on, right, before you pull it out. That would be another instance of fine-grained spatial touch in which your visual brain is probably involved. And we know that through research that's been done on using imaging, fMRI, and TMS. So you ask people to close their eyes. You don't even need to be blindfolded, and touch things that are kind of a little complicated, like keys and different sorts of objects that are not just rectangles and spheres, but have nubs on them and stuff like that. And you ask them to judge something, how many nubs are there, are there as many indentations as there are appendages in this object or something like that. So it's a more tricky task. And as they're doing that, you image the back of the brain where the visual regions are, and it shows that, yeah, they are using their visual brains when they're asked to do something like this. And then you do this, TMS where you break that part of the brain temporarily, and you find that people are not as good at discriminating complex objects by touch. Okay? So it seems that this idea of the visual brain kind of coming in to help touch isn't just for blind individuals, nor is it just for blind people that have been blindfolded for 5 days or blind people that have been blindfolded for 3 hours. Plasticity seems to be something that occurs even for just very short instances when we need to do something complicated with touch and we're not able to look at the thing. So it's like the visual brain, touch is saying, this is a hard thing. This is a hard thing to discriminate. Pulling up the strangest things from my garage. This is a hard thing to discriminate because I can't see it, and it's hard to discriminate by touch. Visual brain, since you're not looking at anything now, can you help out? And visual brain goes, sure. Visual brain will help you better understand what something is through touch, even though it's not an instance of blindness or blindfolding or anything like that. So what we're saying here is something really profound. This idea of cross-modal, cross-sensory plasticity, where a part of the brain that we consider to be, dedicated to one sense helps another sense, is part of the strategy of all brains, not just ones that have had a serious sensory deprivation, not just blind brains or even people that have been blindfolded for 5 days. It's a strategy of your brain. This happens with your brain. And believe it or not, this is something that wasn't known, say, 15 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago. We did used to think the visual brain was just dedicated to vision. And yeah, for blind people, yes, it would then get rededicated to touch and hearing a little bit. And the hearing brain was dedicated just to hearing. And yeah, for deaf people, maybe it would get rededicated to touch and sight a little bit. But no, the visual brain and sensory intact people is just for vision, and the hearing brain for auditorily intact people was just for hearing. That's what we used to think. Now we know that things are more flexible. So your visual brain can be used for touch for all of us. In some cases, maybe even sound. Your auditory brain can also be used for touch and sight in some cases. There is a flexibility. There's a plasticity that goes on there that we didn't think, say, 20 years ago. We used to think of the brain as much more rigid, except for people that were sensory impaired. But for all of us, plasticity seems to be something that can be used by the brain. And so now what we're going to do is we're really going to get into some of the mechanics. Oh, okay, I give you a break here. Okay, that's nice. That's good. I'm nice of me. I thought we were going to get into some real technical stuff. This next part, is I think you'll find very interesting. It's kind of one of the potential practical uses of cross-modal plasticity. We'll talk about how viable it is in just a second. But they've been working on this sort of device for blind individuals for a long time. And it's a device that allows the blind to be able to use their touch system to decipher scenes that are in front of them. Okay, so say you're looking at this scene on the bottom of the screen of a car that's, I guess, passing an intersection, or maybe it's parked across from an intersection or something like that. And that is not something you can touch directly, obviously. You're standing on the other side of the intersection. But it is something a blind person needs to be able to somehow perceive if they're going to know when it's safe to cross a street. Are there devices that we can give to the blind that would allow them to perceive things at a distance so they can be safer? And one device I'm going to be talking about now, because it actually is available if you wanted to buy it, and they've been working on it a long time, is something called the tongue display unit. And I'll talk a tiny bit about its mechanics here, and then I'm going to hopefully be able to show you a video that was from a science show that will describe it a little bit more. But what the tongue display unit is basically it's basically a little kind of cable very small, thin, light cable that has at its ends a set of kind of, I don't know, stimuli, little kind of diodes that are at the end. They're very small, and here you can see its relationship in size relative to the tongue. So you can see it fits right on the tongue here. And these little things kind of just impart a very small electrical charge, very small. I've actually had a chance to use one of these, and it's not nearly as unpleasant as it sounds. You know what it's like? It's like when it's on and it's, you know, kind of stimulating your tongue. It's kind of like this. I don't know if you can tell this, but this is actually fizzy water. You know how fizzy water kind of tickles your tongue a little bit, or champagne tickles your tongue a little bit? That's the way it feels. But here's a question. Can you use that tongue tickling to convey scenes? Can you take an image like this and somehow kind of transfer it using computer processing so that image then is set up on this grid so it stimulates your tongue? Okay. I should say there's a little bit of history of this too. In the old days, they had tried to devise things like this, where there would be like a grid of not like little electrodes, but instead little posts that would vibrate, and they would try to, you know, basically create a pattern on your back skin. Using little tiny posts. There'd be like, I don't know, 50 posts back there that would vibrate, and ask people, okay, can you tell what shape this vibration pattern is? And people would say, is it a square? Is it the letter A? That sort of thing. And people could do it to some degree. But what they wanted to do is put it on the tongue, because this thing on the back was not very usable. It was heavy. You know, the back isn't that sensitive to touch. The tongue is much more sensitive to touch, and because the tongue, you know, has such great electrical conductivity because of the moisture, it allowed the whole apparatus to be much more transportable. You didn't need mechanical devices that were actually vibrating, and therefore you didn't need an energy source, you know, that could power vibrating, you know, little posts. Instead, it's a very light sort of thing. You know, I don't know if you've ever this is how bored we were when we were kids. We didn't have the internet, so this is what we did for thrills. If you take a 9-volt battery, you know, the square batteries, and touch the top with your tongue, okay, you get a little shock. Did you ever do that? Probably not. You guys have the internet. We didn't. It kind of conveys the point that your tongue is a really pretty good electrical conductor. So if you touch it with your, you know, tongue, you get a little shock. That is not how this feels, by the way, this tongue display unit. It is much subtler. It's much more like the tickles of bubbles on your tongue. But can your tongue, the touch sensitivity of your tongue, interpret if the pattern is making a square, making the letter A, making a vertical versus a horizontal line? Okay, and it's probably going to be tough in the beginning, but can people be trained so that potentially the blind can use this as essentially a seeing machine? Let's go ahead and watch this video, and hopefully it will at least sound good if you're not able to see anything, and it will do a nice job portraying that, I think.
Roger Bain looks like an independent guy who loves his power tools. And he is. But here's what he's actually seen since he was a young man. But part of his world is slowly coming back into focus through experimental technology called BrainPort. One day it could actually help blind people see, in a sense, using their tongues. Yes, their tongues. It swaps tiny cameras for eyes and transforms the images into electrical impulses that are felt on the tongue.
It's as if it's drawing on the tongue the still image. And so if you capture the images fast enough, paint them fast enough, it's like a video display. Instead of being on a screen, now it's on your tongue. You know, when you're a kid, I don't know if you did or not, but when you're kids would draw on your back and try to guess what it is.
In normal vision, the eyes send signals to the middle of the brain. From there, the signals are sent directly to the visual cortex at the back of the brain. Not so for the blind. The BrainPort retrains the way the brain processes information by first stimulating the tongue with an array of tiny electrodes. The nerves in the tongue send signals through a different pathway to the brainstem and the area that deals with touch. Eventually, the blind person learns to interpret touch as sight in the visual cortex. Sounds impossible? Well, watch how Roger walks through the Brainport office without any guidance. He can navigate this obstacle course, picking out specific shapes. Excellent. The camera sees this image, Roger feels it on his tongue, and that's how he can even spot the logo on a football jersey.
Very good.
Other blind volunteers recognize numbers.
Blind.
It's like learning a language. At first, you might need to spend a lot of time thinking about what the translation is. I may feel stimulation in the right front part of my tongue. What does that mean? But very rapidly, like learning a language, you might learn a few quick vocabulary, and eventually you become so fluent that you don't need to think about it anymore.
Blindfolded, I try it myself. After a humbling first attempt,
I want to say it's diagonal.
Okay. And this one is vertical.
I managed to understand some of the Brainport language.
I want to say it goes this way.
You are correct.
The technology is improving. Today, a car looks like this to a Brainport user. A few months from now, they hope it will look like this. And in a year and a half, more like this. For the blind, they're a glimpse at more freedom.
This develops where the next generation can really get benefits from it. Even if I don't get the greatest out of it, I'm still can determine if I can see their eyes and maybe see a smile or a grin, you know, that kind of stuff. It can be cool.
And for the rest of us, it's a miraculous look at how our brains can be trained to rewire themselves. Daniel Seberg, CBS News, Madison, Wisconsin.
Cool. Okay, that does a nice job of kind of describing how this works and what its implications are. But I want to give you a little bit more detail. There's been a lot of research on this. And the question is, how effective is it? I mean, this is, you know, been around for a while. I should say that it isn't used by very many people. But I think at the very least, it kind of just portrays some interesting aspects of perception and how the brain works, and of course, this idea of cross-modal plasticity. So, you know, they tried to train a lot of people, both blind and sighted. Of course, the blind typically will ultimately do better with this, but let me tell you a little bit what happens. Without training, typically people will be able to decipher lines, the angles of lines, the orientation of lines, as well as whether something is a line or a curve. And again, one thing you should do here is you should imagine tickles on your tongue, like, you know, you're putting this square on your tongue, and there's tickles on your tongue, bubbles on your tongue. Are you going to be able to feel that there's a line of bubbles on your tongue going one way or another? I mean, it's a hard thing to do, but people can do lines, they can do curves. And then after some training, they can do better. They can determine shapes. They can determine if something's moving, like if somebody rolls a ball in front of you, they can say, oh yes, it's a ball, it's a sphere, and it's moving from left to right. They can traverse mazes, the walk-around mazes that you saw that individual doing there. And to some degree, you can do letters. I mean, you can't really functionally read with this sort of thing. But you can, you know, discriminate letters one at a time. Okay, so it's difficult. It's not something that's that easy to do. And again, whether or not it's going to be useful for blind people, so it really is something that's sold to many, many blind people, still seems questionable. But it does really make some interesting points, I think, about the brain. So when you talk to people who've been trained, whether they are blind or sighted, if they've been trained, say, for a number of weeks, some months, they will start to say interesting things. They'll start to say, well, you know, I do feel tickles on my tongue, and I am doing it that way, but I'm starting to really perceive things out in front of me. So, you know, at first, the first day I tried this, I would be able to kind of translate back and forth. I feel a line of bubbles, so there must be a line in front of me. I feel a curve of bubbles, there must be a curve. And then they'll next day, or probably not the next day, probably a few weeks after some training, they'll say, okay, I feel a sphere kind of moving, a circle moving across my tongue. But then many weeks later, they'll say, yeah, I still feel that sphere moving across my tongue, but I'm now starting to feel like there's something out in front of me, that the ball is actually out in front of me. And then as they start walking around, they'll say, yeah, I'm feeling things on my tongue always, but really what I'm concentrating on is something out in front of me. I really have a sense that there is something outside my body, not just not just stimulation on my tongue, but something outside the body. And I think this is fascinating. I absolutely believe this is happening. It is like echolocation. Remember, we talked about this in some detail about echolocation, that it is something that people do experience as an object in front of them that they don't experience as sound. This is a little different. They do experience it as touch, but then they also experience it as something outside of them, outside their body. It's thought that when that kind of introspective experience happens, when they no longer just feel tickles, but they also have an experience of things outside their body, that is when the visual brain areas get involved, right? So you knew this was coming, right? That as people get better at this, probably the visual brain is going to get involved with this somehow and start helping out the little tickles interpretation of the tongue, right? It's starting to help the touch system be more sophisticated with that tickle. When it gets involved for real, when you start seeing visual involvement, that's about the time when people experience perception of things out in front of them. So I think it's great. It's a really great kind of correspondence. When you're good enough at this that you no longer just feel tickles, but you have some experience of things out in front of you, that's when the visual brain's coming in and saying, okay, let's see if we can interpret what's going on spatially. And it's giving you that kind of introspective experience. Okay, I think it's just really interesting. I should say that, what's this like now? The book was 2010, of course. I think the video is from 2012, 2013. How much better are these things now? They're not much better. So the issue is, they were hoping to increase the resolution by adding more of these little diodes here, more little stimulation diodes here. So I don't know how many are here. Was it like 6 times 6, whatever it is? I can't see what this is actually, 36 or something. They wanted to put 100 here on the tongue, and hopefully that would increase the resolution of, maybe going from something like this image in the middle to something like this on the right, eventually going to a really, really detailed image. And the problem turns out to be you can put more little diodes here on the little tongue chip that's resting on your tongue, but your tongue is sensitive very sensitive to touch. But whether it can discriminate between these little tiny diodes well enough to be able to do this is another question. It's unclear. So the resolution is still poor. I don't think most blind people that have used it, and I've talked to many, including Daniel Kish, I don't think most blind people feel like it would be useful enough to walk around with this on their tongue. Of course, for Daniel, he finds clicks and listening to sound so important that putting it on his tongue would definitely inhibit it. Even if you're not an active echolocator with your tongue, you would want to be able to talk. So, to people if you're walking with them. So most blind people I've talked to said this is not ready for prime time. Whether it will ever be is another question. So, but I thought you'd find that interesting. And there's a lot of questions. Yeah, let me go ahead and take them. Okay, oops. So, good. Thank you for the questions. Kimberly asks, are there any updates on that technology? The video looks a little old. You're absolutely right. Hopefully I answered that question. I have not looked at that literature in a few years, but I have talked to blind individuals about various what we call prosthetic devices or visual aids and stuff like that. And my sense is no, that this is not ready for prime time. They are having now a little bit more success with retinal implantation and things like that. Actually putting, visually or optically sensitive, light sensitive sensors in the back of the eye, and probably that's where people see things going for visual aids for the blind now, much more so than touch. But still, this is interesting. Okay, Ralph asks, for the tongue unit display unit, wouldn't it also vary Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so people who are super tasters, which is not something I've talked about in the class. I don't think I included it in the book. Maybe I did. I might have. The book is concentrated on things that most of us, perceptual skills that most of us have. But there are people called super tasters who seem to have more taste buds than the average person. And they might, yeah, you're right, their tongue layout might be a little bit different than other people's when it comes to touch sensitivity as well, because of the number of taste buds they have. So you're right, super tasters might not have the same sensitivity. You might be absolutely right. Okay, wow, that took longer than I hoped it would. Let me see something here. All right, okay, let me do a question and then we'll take our break. Sorry about that, but shoot. Yeah, we can take a little break here after that. Okay, so let me do our polling question here. Let's talk about, we just asked that. Sorry. Okay. When would you be using your visual brain to help you touch? Under what conditions would you be using your visual brain to help you touch? A, after 5 days of visual deprivation, 5 days of being blindfolded. B, after 3 hours of visual deprivation. C, when trying to identify a spatially complex object by touch, such as your keys in your pocket. Or D, all of the above. Okay. Go ahead and read it carefully and go ahead and give us an answer. You're doing pretty well. Give you another few seconds. All right. Most people have answered. I think we're fine here. The correct answer is, in fact, D, all of the above. So yes, remember from that whole experiment of being blindfolded in a hospital room for 5 days, your visual brain is shown to be active during touch, right? So all the imaging showed that. B is also true, 3 hours of visual deprivation. So your visual brain is active after 3 hours and you're asked to discriminate patterns on the skin from those little pressure things, determining whether it's horizontal or vertical. You do get better at it with visual deprivation, and your visual brain does become active in that task. But then we also talked about, so the B is also correct. We also talked about C, trying to identify your keys in your pocket or your phone, so you can pull them out with the right key or the right orientation for your phone. Those would be instances, in fact, where your visual brain area does help your sense of touch. And so the correct answer is definitely all of the above, D. That should be pretty straightforward. Most of you got that. Okay. Are there any other questions about this? We'll come back and talk more about it, but any questions at this point? Okay, great. Why don't we take our 10-minute break, and I will see you at 11:30. Okay, everybody, we're back. I'm a monkey. I thought since you're all doing so well, I would give you a little treat later on. So after we go through what I think is probably one of the more technical slides, we're going to do a special treat for you. We'll take a little break and do a special treat because you've all been doing so well. But I think we can continue with our discussion, assuming there's no questions. Any questions before we continue? We'll leave the monkeys up there, but I will change. Somebody is asking a question. Oh, I'm muted. Oh, you know, I actually, all right, I'm better now. I think I revealed my video too soon, so you saw me change into a monkey. That's okay. You knew that I wasn't a real monkey, I assume. Okay. Okay, we're good. Let's go back to this. Good. All right. Those are some cute monkeys. So, yeah, the tongue display unit is kind of it's nothing else, kind of an interesting way of portraying some of the properties of cross-modal plasticity. I especially think that that relationship between what one experiences as things outside the body and that being the point at which the visual brain really becomes involved is especially interesting. But as we discussed, it might not be the future of seeing devices for the blind. That's okay. It's still instructive, and you know, a lot of companies are working on many very different things for this type of issue. But let's talk now about what we'll call general plasticity. So we're going to take a second and move away from this cross-modal plasticity idea. And we're going to talk about the general concept of plasticity instead. And we'll do this in the context of touch, since this is our, you know, we're just the big, you know, chapter topic for us is touch. And I'm using touch now to really talk about plasticity. And showing that's because that's where a lot of the research on plasticity has occurred. It's been easier to do with touch than other sorts of senses. But I do want to make sure that we realize that the properties of plasticity, of brain changing to kind of accommodate experience, is something that's not just true of touch; it's true of the other senses as well. But we're going to talk now about the touch in the, plasticity in the touch brain area now specifically. So we're going to move from what's going on in the visual cortex when we touch to the touch cortex, the part of our brain that is responsible for detecting touch most often. And as you can see, this is now the same type of general image we saw before. And you're looking at the brain kind of from the front as if it's, you know, kind of sliced like this. And you're seeing how different regions of the body are mapped onto different regions of that strip of the brain, depending not on the size of the part of the body, right? Legs are a lot bigger than faces, but how sensitive that part of the body is. So as you can see, as we've been discussing, there's a lot of that region dedicated to the lips and the face and the mouth, the tongue, the eyes, that sort of thing. And not quite as much, but a lot to the hand, given, you know, the size of the hand relative to something like the leg and the trunk of the body and that sort of thing. Okay, but now we're going to start looking at how this map kind of changes, how it gets restructured by virtue of experience. Okay, so the more you touch in a certain way, it's going to turn out the more your brain areas can start shifting around and growing and inducing other areas to kind of make room for that. We'll talk first about, you know, folks that we know who have a lot of touch experience, and we've talked. They make a nice kind of example for us, and that's blind people who have learned Braille. You know, again, it's the 10% of blind people who use Braille. And I wish I had some Braille here, but certainly you know what it looks like. Imagine my hand as a Braille card. There's little bumps here. The way blind folks learn to read Braille is by using the 3 middle fingers on each hand. So they'll kind of scan along like, you know, this down the page. And what you find is people who do this regularly actually have a little bit of a different mapping on the touch brain area. Unsurprisingly, they have more area dedicated to those 3 fingers than the rest of us do, because they're using those 3 fingers for fine-grained touch discrimination. By the way, they also do use their visual brain for this, of course, but now we're just talking about the touch areas of their brain. There's a shifting around here of the map, so they give a little bit more of the region to the 3 middle fingers of each hand. Okay, but you don't have to be a Braille user to show this sort of switch. If you're a musician and you've been playing most of your life, there's a good chance that your touch brain areas have shifted around to accommodate your manual skill at touching your instrument. So, for example, violin players, and we're not even talking about professional violin players, we're just talking about people who've played violin for a good portion of their lives. They have more area on their touch strips dedicated to their left-hand fingers than their right-hand fingers. Right? We're now talking about left-handed violinists. And boy, I do have, no, that's all right. I actually have something like a violin I could show you, but it's not worth the getting out. So anyway, this is now we're talking about right-handed violinists, right? People who play the violin with the right-handed. What they'll do is they'll hold the violin with their left hand. And so the fingerboard's here. And then they'll use their right hand to bow the strings, right? What really needs to have fine-grained touch skills to be very sensitive for touch are the fingers of the left hand that are moving on the fingerboard. This hand's kind of clenched closed, and yeah, you have to be able to move the bow accurately and very, with a lot of skill. But in terms of the touch of the fingers, these left-hand fingers need to really be sensitive in how they are moved. Okay, and what you find is if you look at the motor strips of violin players, and you look at the one, there's also, I should have mentioned, there's one on the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. The one that is responsible, or I guess involved in left-hand touch, which happens to be on the right side, don't worry about that crossing, will show more area dedicated to those left-hand fingers than the corresponding other brain region on the other side of the brain that corresponds to the right-hand fingers. Because again, for right-handed violiners, the left-hand fingers have to have a very good sense of touch in order to know where they are on the fingerboard, in order to press down with just the right amount, in order to move around, in order to get like a vibrato type of sound, that sort of thing. But it's not just true of violin players, it's true of people who use tools. So for example, people who use screwdrivers or pliers in their profession and use them regularly, people who need to do wiring in houses and stuff like that, you do find that their brains shift around so that they can make room for things like the fingers that are involved in actually turning a screwdriver. They have to be able to feel how much resistance is there in the screw very accurately in order to know not to break the screw or something like that. If you've ever used a screwdriver and you've done some work with screws, you know that you're using your sense of touch as well as the muscles to actually make the motion. You need to know when to stop. You need to know when to push down harder if the screw's a little tight, that sort of thing. Your sense of touch will get heightened with those involved fingers if this is something you do regularly, if this is part of your profession. But it can even actually be shown in the context of an experiment. This is an experiment where people were asked to take tongs. I should have brought some tongs in. This sort of things like you might use on a grill to grab a piece of meat and flip it. Those kind of big tong things. They were asked to use tongs to move. I think they had like little rubber corks or something on a board, and they were asked to use the tongs to move the rubber corks to different positions, maybe inside different holes on a wooden board. And after they did this for a number of hours, they did the little brain imaging, and they found that, yeah, their area that would be dedicated to the fingers that are being used for the tongs gets shifted around. And then interestingly, you find an area that isn't really dedicated to the fingers at all, but something in between, almost as if the brain was making room for the tongs as being part of the body. That's a little weird. Okay, so let's step back for a second and talk about how this sort of thing is done. In order to know after an experience with a tool or the violin player or the braille user, what you have to do is you have to map out the area by touching various parts of the body. You say, oh yeah, that part's lighting up when I touch the arm, that part's lighting up when I touch the face, all that sort of stuff. And you do find more area dedicated to the fingers if they're using that consistently for their hobby or their profession or whatever. But for the tool use, it turns out that they're actually, yes, they're making more room so that they can have better touch skills in their fingers, but there'll be a tiny bit of that area that doesn't seem to be sensitive to touch on any part of the fingers. And it's thought that what you're actually doing is you're using the tongs as kind of an extension of your fingers, of your arm and hand even, to kind of feel where the rubber stopper is and control it really well so you can move it around and put it in its various holes. So it's almost as if the brain makes room for this new part of your body. And it also happens with people who use screwdrivers and pliers and things like that regularly for their job. But the fact that it can happen just in the context of maybe a 3-hour experiment or something like that is really interesting. It suggests that this plasticity that happens in your touch area can happen fairly quickly, which is really cool. Finally, what happens with your sense of touch with this kind of new area dedicated to it? And what you find is that people who use their fingers for a hobby or a profession that involves kind of very sensitive touch. I don't know. Say I think sometimes people who do woodworking have to feel how smooth a board is and whether there's any ridges in it. Many musicians have to have a very fine sense of touch, as we said with the violinist. But this experiment was done with piano players, people who played piano for a good portion of their lives, but weren't necessarily professional. And what they found is that they actually did have a more sensitive sense of touch for the fingers that were involved, all the fingers that were involved in the piano. So what they say is they have better two-point touch sensitivity, and this gives me a little chance to talk about how you kind of test sensitivity in touch. This is a little device that's used in most, rehabilitation centers, say for elderly people. Remember before we talked about the fact that as you grow older, you lose your sense of touch to some degree. Your sense of touch becomes less sensitive. This is a way of measuring that. So, you can buy this, on the internet, no problem. And places that that work with the elderly often have these sorts of things. And basically, it's just a way of determining how touch sensitive a person's, body part is, like the skin on their hands versus the skin on their feet or leg or something like that. And it's just called two-point sensitivity. And basically, it's a little device here. I brought some points here, and these are just little nails. Make sure you can see these, can you? Yeah, okay. Little nails. And the question here would be, as I say I'm blindfolded, and I put the nails so that their point is together, exactly together, and I touch my skin, and my job would be to say whether I can feel 1 point or 2 points. And then what I do is I slowly move these points apart, and we can determine at what point will I say there's 2 points versus 1 point. And for old people, you have to pull them out pretty far apart, right? You have to get them like somewhere like around, can you see this? Let me pull my picture here so I know what you're seeing. Can't see myself right now, just the monkeys. Yeah, right. So they'd have to be somewhere like about there on the skin of the hand for people to tell that it's 2 points. Where for most of us, those of us that are younger, you would need something more like this. This would feel like 1 point to everybody. This would feel like 2 points maybe to people in their 30s and 40s, but people in their 70s sometimes need it that far apart. Okay, that's just to give you an idea. And so that's what this is basically replicating, that little plastic thing. It's much better than doing with nails, I'll tell you that. So that's how you test 2-point touch sensitivity. And as I said, that decreases as you get older, unless you're blind, and then it offsets that to some degree. But if you're a pianist too, it would offset it with the hands, at least. So pianists throughout their life will have better 2-point touch sensitivity on their hands, and that will also offset their, the decrease that happens with age. And yes, in fact, you do see that, there is a disproportionate area of the brain that is dedicated to the fingers because of this experience-induced shifting around. And this is plasticity. This is what plasticity is about. It's a kind of a shifting around a little bit of brain areas, regions of the brain, in order to kind of accommodate one's experience, whether it's an experience of touch or sound or whatever. So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually do the kind of most challenging slide of the class. But you're all very smart, so I think you'll have no problem with this. What we're going to do is talk about a little bit of the kind of superficial neurophysiology that's involved in plasticity. And we're going to talk about 2 types of plasticity. And we actually have been mentioning one, short-term plasticity. And what short-term plasticity is what happens as the kind of brain changes a little bit for the short term. So, for example, being blindfolded for 3 hours, we do see visual cortex involvement in touch. But it reverts, and I talked about it reverting also, even in the case of a 5-day blindfolding. You take the blindfold off, and there's a reversion too. That would be short-term plasticity. Long-term plasticity is something that a person who's been blind for a long time will have involvement in visual cortex, and that's going to occur even if they're lucky enough to have some vision restored. So it is something that physicians need to know about. People that do kind of rehabilitation therapy, they have to kind of determine these sorts of things. How long does short-term plasticity need to be kind of induced so it shifts into long-term plasticity? So let's talk about what's going on in these cases, because it's going to be relevant for many clinical cases, as well as our understanding of what's going on. So let's first talk about short-term plasticity. Okay. So what I like to do here, I should probably put some images of this, but probably you folks down here in Southern California haven't had too many instances to deal with old apartments, interiors. So I grew up in the Northeast, and when I was, in college and graduate school, I lived in old, sections of houses. Typically what they do is they the old big houses in, say, Connecticut, where I went to graduate school, they would divide the house up and make them into apartments. Like the first floor would be one apartment, the second floor would be another, the third floor would be, and they'd be beautiful old apartments because they were parts of beautiful old houses. But there would be parts of them that weren't very functional. Okay, because the first floor was designed just to be a kitchen and a dining room, or maybe a sitting room or something like that. Sometimes things would be a little kind of clumsy, or the second floor would just usually be for bedrooms. So I was on a second floor apartment, and they had put a kitchen in, and they'd converted one of the bedrooms into a dining room. But what they had done is because of, okay, so how did this work? I can't remember exactly what so they opened up a little bit of the wall between the kitchen and the dining room, but it wasn't very functional. In fact, there was an entire wall that covered, entire surface that covered much of that space in between. And there was an old door there that had been painted shut. Oh, I know what it was. Yeah, we had to go into the hallway to go into the kitchen, back and forth between the dining room and the kitchen. And there was a wall there, and there was a door there that had been painted shut. And what we decided to do was to chip away the paint of that door and start using the door so we could go between the kitchen and the dining room. You can imagine that's a really useful thing, so you don't have to go into the hallway. So we're opening up something between the kitchen and dining rooms to make it more efficient, okay? What we're doing is something analogous to what's going on in short-term plasticity. Because what we're doing is we're making connections where maybe before there were some, like the door could be open before, so there would be a connection between these rooms. We're kind of we're reusing what we can say are dormant connections between cells. So at first, we're trying to make the passageway between the two rooms more efficient. Like you're trying to make the passage between two cells, two neurons in the brain more efficient. And we're making use of what is a connection that wasn't being used for a long time, this doorway, and now we're using it. And when we do that, we're able to establish the kind of more efficient connection between the cells or between the rooms. Okay, you get that? And then what can happen is the more you use that door, the more that door is going to be staying opened. And in fact, what we could do after a while, okay, is we could take off the door so we don't even have to open and close it anymore. And so using that, once kind of closed connection, we're now using it and we're making it more efficient. We say, hey, we don't even need this door here. We're going to make this a more efficient connection between the rooms. That's what's going on between cells as we're establishing short-term plasticity. Okay? So we've taken off the door now, and that's there. That's going to be really, really useful. Okay? At that point, we're going to start giving rise to what's called long-term plasticity, where we now have connections between these rooms or between cells that are going to be long-lasting. And in fact, at that point, we're sustaining. We've taken off the door, so we're sustaining that connection that wasn't being used. Okay, we're sustaining that once dormant connection. And now what we decided to do, kind of pretend, but what we decided to do is actually, this is working so well. We like having this opening here between the rooms so well. Let's knock down that whole wall and make the connection between the rooms just completely opened. So what you're doing is you're now creating new connections between the rooms. Okay, so maybe we'll leave a little, bit of it over here or something like that, but we're knocking out that door. We took off the hinges, and now we're kind of knocking down the wall to the side, and we've kind of created new connections, or a bigger connection, I guess, between the two rooms, and that's what's going on with long-term plasticity. Now, the cells are communicating so effectively back and forth because of that establishing of short-term plasticity. Now new connections can be made, and that's how long-term plasticity occurs. That's how you're going to have long-lasting changes in the brain. Okay, so you're connecting new data. And this is thought to be what the basis of plasticity in the blind is, or the expertise when we're talking about people who are violinists for most of their life, or many, many years or something like that. The short-term plasticity that, if it's not kind of tended to, might, revert, right? So if, you don't use that, you stop using that door to some degree, the door is probably going to close, and you'll stop using it for whatever reason. Maybe the next family comes in and they don't use the door, they close it, paint it up again, right? But you are using it consistently. You took the door off. You made the wall next to the door that much more. You knocked it down, making that connection that much more efficient. And that's what's going on between cells as you go from short-term plasticity to long-term plasticity as it occurs in the blind and with some sort of perceptual expertise, which is everything, or most everything we've been talking about this quarter. So now you know something about what the neuron mechanisms are that kind of underlie all this kind of expert stuff we've been talking about this quarter, like whether we're talking about Daniel Kish and using his visual brain areas for hearing now, okay, that gets established and kind of made, long-term real, long-term concrete by going from short-term practice-based plasticity into a long-term sort of state of now Daniel's always going to use his visual cortex for sound, okay? Same thing with John Bramblett, who's learning to touch. And it's, again, not just true for those folks. It's true for someone like, what's his name, Stephen Poe, the wine connoisseur, right? He's going to have connections between the smell and taste areas of his brain that many of us aren't going to have because of his expertise. At first, it was a short-term set of connections, but it got established to be a long-term set of connections by opening up the communication between those areas through the cells, okay? So that's what's going on. And I got a little experiment that I want to just describe to you to kind of make this a little bit more concrete, a little bit more real to you. And this is going to be a different type of kind of task. What we're going to be talking about is a keyboard pattern. Hey, guess what I have here? I have the very keyboard that's pictured there. Look at that. It just happens to be next to me in the garage, right? And this is an experiment where people came in and were asked to learn a little keyboard pattern. None of these people had any experience playing piano or anything like that. But they learned a little melody, and it's a little involved melody. It's a little piano piece. I think they kind of made it up, the piano piece, but it was melodic sounding. It kind of sounded nice. And it took a little while, they had to, the piano piece, I think, was about 30 seconds long at least. It wasn't that easy. It took some real learning to do this. But they were asked to come in and play the piano piece for a certain number of hours of the day to practice it, basically. 2 hours a day. Okay, so that's how they do it. So it's 2 hours a day for 5 days a week. How much should we pay them? I don't know, not as much as the blindfolding experiment as far as I'm concerned, but we'll give them some money. Let's give them $300. Okay. So 2 hours a day for 5 days. Cool. And what you do then is you image their brains and see what's going on. And you do the imaging in an interesting way. You first image their brains before they practice and then after they practice. And actually what we're going to image here, it could have been the touch area, but in this case it's going to be the next part over. It's the motor area. It's going to be more about kind of motor or kind of coordination plasticity, but it could work with touch too. Let's just call it touch for our purposes. It's the same exact principle. And what you do is you first, before they do the keyboard pattern, you first image their brain to see if there's a lot of area devoted to their fingers in that brain region. And when they first come in, there's not. But then you have them practice for 2 hours. And, it takes some practice. I think they get auditory feedback a little bit, just so it makes it a little bit more interesting so they can hear the melody. And they're asked to play it, with a very steady, kind of rhythm, and to press the keys with the same amount of pressure. So it is, it's a challenging task. It's something that it takes at least that much time to really learn well. They're really trying to do better and better. And then after that 2 hour period, what they'll do is they'll image them again. And what they find is, in fact, after the 2 hour practice period, their brains are restructured. Their brains show that there is more area dedicated to the fingers that are involved. In my case, it would be the right hand fingers that are involved in learning that skill. So right after the 2 hours of practice, you image them, and yes, it does seem that the brain reorganizes after each practice session. Okay? So they come in the next day, you image them before they practice. Now, things have reverted after the 2 hour practice. Yeah, it's there again. Very cool. All right, good. Experiment's done for half of you. The other half, I've got good news. I want you to go home and practice the pattern for 2 hours a day over the next 4 weeks. All right, how much am I going to give you? You should just be happy that you're going to learn such a wonderful keyboard pattern, but I'll pay you. I will pay you $1,000, okay? The other group's done, so, they don't have to do anything, but we actually are going to have them come back later on, but just once. But this group, boy, that's a lot of work. And, you know, I think what they did is they took this little thing and they hooked it up to a computer, and then the computer downloaded to some mainframe so they could be sure that people were really taking this seriously. And they practiced at home by themselves for 2 hours a day for 4 weeks. And you can imagine they got very, very good at this. Okay. And then they had them come back to the lab. And they said, okay, we're going to do the same thing. We want to see how good you are. But before that, we want to image your brain before, like we used to, and then after you go through your practice session to see what the differences might be. And this time, before they actually did the practice session, 2-hour session, when they looked at their brains, they found that the organization that they had only seen before after the sessions was now there for real. Okay? In other words, it had been sustained. That little shifting around of their touch brain area in order to kind of heighten the sensitivity of that hand now isn't something that just appeared after the practice session. It appeared without them practicing at all. It became long-term. The long-term plasticity now was there in their brain, potentially forever. And, you know, this is kind of a excruciating experiment, but it is something I think that really demonstrates an important part of what experience is like. And you probably, I'm sure you guys can all think of experiences in your life where you learned a new skill, whether it's a new musical instrument, whether it's a sport. Sport might be the easiest thing, you know. I remember when I was first learning to catch a ball, how old were you when you do this, like 2, 3, 4 years old, something like that. And it's really hard, you know, like that. And then all of a sudden, you know, you're able to catch the ball and it's kind of solid in there. It's really, really in there. And you don't have to worry about it. It's kind of become second nature. And that is exactly an example of going from short-term plasticity to long-term plasticity. And I hope I can still catch a ball. My kids don't play ball with me anymore, but I'm assuming I can still do it as well as I used to. And it's an example of short-term to long-term plasticity. And we all, if we think back on it, whenever we were learning a new sport, that's what was going on. When we were learning, you know, to play an instrument, any sort of kind of practice-based skill is going to involve this sort of thing. You know, when I was an undergraduate, I did a senior recital on guitar, classical guitar. And my teacher told me, to be ready for a recital, to be ready for a concert, you have to be so well practiced that you don't need to warm up, right? So you need to be able to sit down, like coming in from the cold of upstate New York where I went to college. You have to sit down with your cold hands and start playing a piece, and it has to sound as good as it used to after a warm-up. You should be as good at these pieces as you can be, to the point where you don't need to warm up before you start playing. And basically, what he's saying is you need to practice so you can do whatever sort of finger movements you need to do so they go from being short-term plasticity-based to long-term plasticity-based. I think it was a really kind of interesting way of putting it for a teacher. I thought it was really interesting. So if you're able to follow that, good work. That's tough stuff. Let's take a little break, and first we'll do some see if you have any questions, then I'll ask you a poll question, and then you're in for a special treat. Okay. Stop sharing, and let's see if we have any questions about short-term versus long-term plasticity. Any questions? No? Okay. If you think of some as they come up, no problem. I'll ask you a polling question. All right, let's see what we can do here. Oh, well, let me see this one. You know, okay, I'm going to ask you about short-term and long-term plasticity. I know it's coming right away. You haven't had time to digest it and make it long-term, right? But I think, you know, this will allow us to think about the stuff I just went through to make sure that you get another kind of way of understanding it. So the question is this. It's kind of a fill in the blanks question. Short-term plasticity involves blank, while long-term plasticity involves blank. And so the first answer is short-term plasticity involves forming of new cell connections, and long-term plasticity involves use of dormant cell connections. This is a little tricky. It's okay if you don't get this right. This is one of the hardest ones we've done because you haven't really had a chance to study this yet. That's okay. B, short-term plasticity involves use of dormant cell connections, while long-term plasticity involves forming of new cell connections. C, short-term plasticity involves generation of new brain cells, while long-term plasticity involves loss of brain cells. And D, short-term plasticity involves loss of brain cells, while long-term plasticity involves generation of new brain cells. I'm going to give you some time. I want you to think, read, look back at your notes if you want. It's a little tricky. If you get it wrong, it's no problem. I just want you to have another way of thinking about this, another way of learning it. Let's go ahead and do that. Take your time, you're doing great. I have total faith in you. Good, I think most of you have answered it, right? Yeah. Okay, let's stop here and we will share the results. Again, I know this is hard, it's all anonymous, it doesn't make a difference whether you get it right or wrong or anything like that. But the correct answer is in fact B. So most of you got this right. The answer is short-term plasticity involves use of dormant cell connections, right? So these are cell connections that would be there but aren't being used, like the door that was painted shut. Remember, that's a dormant kind of connection, dormant door. But you can remember it like that. But dormant just means that it's a connection that's actually not being used, and then you're kind of chipping away the paint, opening the door, and okay, now we have a connection that's being used, right? But that's not in itself gonna be long-term plasticity until you take the door off its hinges and maybe knock a piece of the wall out from the side, so you have a big opening, and that's when long-term plasticity comes in. It's when new cell connections are actually developed between the cells. So the correct answer is B. A is kind of poses it as the reverse. The dormant cell connections get used first during short-term plasticity. You don't use them during long-term plasticity. And this generation of new brain cells, it really isn't going to be part of what we're talking about here. So neither C nor D are correct. So the correct answer is B. Take a picture of it if you haven't, and we'll see if there's any other questions, and then you get your special treat. Okay, cool. Any questions? No? Then it's time for a magic trick. What I'm going to need is a volunteer from the class. Go ahead and if you want to volunteer, go ahead and say so on chat, and we will use you as a volunteer. Who wants to be a volunteer? And it's a very simple card experiment, but I think you'll think it's just miraculous. Oh, come on, somebody please volunteer. Somebody, you're not going to have to do anything silly. You just have to pick a card, basically. You just have to pick a card. Anybody? Okay, thank you, Ralph. I appreciate it. Let's hear it for Ralph. Thank you very much, Ralph. Okay, first of all, Ralph, I want you, it's hard to do, first of all, I want to say it's really hard to do magic tricks over the internet, but Ralph, I want you to look at this deck of cards, and it seems like a regular. Oh, there's Ralph. Thank you so much for the. So it looks like a regular deck of cards, right? It is a regular deck of cards, right? Everything look good?
Yeah.
Okay. What I'm going to do, Ralph, is I'm going to slowly kind of shuffle through the cards, and I want you to tell me when to stop, and that will be the card you choose. Okay? All right. Here we go. Any point?
Stop.
Stop right there. Now, you're sure you want to stop right here, right? I mean, you can go further. I want to make sure that this is absolutely your choice and you don't feel like it's not your choice in any way.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. What I'm going to do is close my eyes and show you and the rest of the... oh, boy. Hold on just a second. I forgot to shuffle the cards. Oh, my gosh. Hold on just a second. I can't believe I blew this. All right. Don't worry. Don't panic, anybody. Don't panic, anybody. We'll start from the beginning. All right. All right. I forgot to shuffle the cards just so you make sure. I'm going to shuffle the cards. Here we go. Okay. Looks like I'm shuffling. Okay. Now I'm going to do this again. Go ahead. You ready, Ralph? You can tell me when to stop anywhere. It's the same thing, the same shuffling. You want me to go further this time, don't you, Ralph? Okay, that's cool.
Okay, you can stop right there.
Stop right there. Do you want to continue? Again, I want you to feel like it's your choice. It's absolutely your choice.
Yeah, it's fine to stop.
Okay, good. All right, now what I'm going to do, this makes it kind of tricky, but you're going to have to trust me. I'm going to close my eyes and show everybody what card Ralph chose. Okay, there's your card, Ralph. Everyone see it? Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it back here and shuffle again with my eyes closed. You got the card, right, Ralph?
Yeah.
All right. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, I'm going to put this behind my back and show you the fastest trick in the entire county. Ready? Your card is this one, right?
No, it was a King of Hearts.
Oh, don't tell me. Oh. Don't tell me. It's okay. All right, I'll get it this time. I promise I'll get it this time. No. You said it was. All right. This happens every once in a while. And for that reason, I have something called the Magician's Insurance Policy. You see this right here?
Yeah.
This is the Magician's Insurance Policy. And it tells me what I have to do when bad magician things happen like this. It says these are the conditions of the policy. All parties must be dealing with a full deck. You ever hear that expression, dealing with a full deck? You say somebody, yeah, okay. Magicians have a terrible sense of humor. What else does it say? This policy does not cover enemy attack by an armed audience. I hope that's not the case because this didn't go well. I hope nobody's armed. Let's see what else we have. Oh, there's one that's been added, I think, very recently. Can you read this here? What does it say?
The small text?
Yeah, right down the bottom there, right there.
I can barely see it. Maximum benefits are derived when this policy is fully extended.
Okay, maximum benefits are derived when this policy is fully extended. What the heck does that mean? Oh, fully extended. Fully extended? Is that what they mean?
That's crazy.
All right. Thank you for your help, Ralph. Thank you. Oh, here, I got this. Because I can't hear you folks here. All right, thanks for your help, Ralph. All right, we'll do some more magic tricks when we start talking about magic later on this quarter. It's so hard to do magic over Zoom. You have no idea. Okay, let's go ahead and share our screen again. And good. I'm going to now talk about a kind of follow-up to this last demonstration that we talked about with regard to this keyboard learning experiment. There actually was another group of subjects in this experiment that I think you're going to find really interesting. And this is not a group that practiced physically, but practiced mentally for 4 days. Okay, so basically, they did the whole thing where they came into the experiment and learned the keyboard pattern and tried it before. They got scanned before and after and everything like that. But then after a while, what they ended up doing was not actually performing with their hands. They actually held their hands down on their knees. They didn't move their hands at all, but they just looked at the keyboard and imagined their hands playing the pattern on the keyboard. it was not just, kind of the concept, I imagine my hand on a keyboard. They actually went through the mental practice involved. And if you know anything about mental practice, if you're an athlete or anything like that, you might know that when you're mentally practicing something like a foul shot in basketball, you have to really concentrate. And you have to kind of concentrate from the perspective of yourself throwing the foul shot. And that's exactly what they did in this experiment. They imagined themselves going through that keyboard pattern bit by bit as if they were actually playing it. And they did, first of all, improve in performance. And if you know anything about, if you're an athlete, if you know anything about mental practice, you know that it actually can happen, right? It does improve your performance. Certainly not as much as real practice would, but mental practice does improve. And this is something that, coaches and trainers tell athletes all the time, that, if you can't be on the basketball court, imagine yourself on the basketball court. Imagine yourself throwing free throws, and you'll find that your free throwing skill will improve faster than if you weren't mentally practicing. So yes, that happened too in the keyboard instance. But they showed the same pattern of plasticity as if they were physically practicing. So in other words, before they did the practicing, they were scanned and they didn't show any reorganization in the touch brain areas. But then after the practice, whether they were physically practicing or mentally practicing, just by imagining themselves going through that pattern, the brain area having to do with touch shifted around. And so it looks like plasticity isn't just something that happens to, people that are experts in something or have visual, deprivation or something. It can happen in very kind of more simple contexts. And it doesn't even involve literal physical practice. Plasticity can occur by thinking about it. Now, I want to be very careful here, because this kind of sounds a little mystical. Whenever I hear myself talking about this issue, I think I got to be careful. I want to make sure that they understand that this isn't the same as physical practice. The plasticity did occur. They did improve, but they certainly didn't improve as much as they were physically practicing, right? But there can be brain changes. Now, you know a little bit about this already. I so wish, out of all my demonstrations from our discussion section, the one I miss doing in person the most is the rubber hand illusion. You guys went through the rubber hand illusion a couple weeks ago, right, with Serena. You know what it's about. You saw the demonstration video, all that. But when you do it live, when you're there in our little laboratory room, discussion section rooms, and we have a whole setup for you. We actually have the same setup that you saw in the video, and we hit that rubber hand. Boy, is it effective. Because as your hand is being tickled, you do start feeling like the rubber hand is your own. And in fact, I imagine Serena mentioned this, the brain changes a little bit to kind of make room for your new rubber hand. And so, yes, there's a mental situation here. Yeah, there's physical stimulation, but there's a mental situation in which you start kind of mentally adopting this rubber hand, and it changes your brain plasticity. It induces this plasticity into the touch regions of your brain. So what's going on with you mentally also has an effect on it. And there's other really cool examples of this. Here, let me pull my image a little bigger. Sorry about that. Other really cool examples of this. Tai Chi, which is what you're seeing there, right? You guys have seen Tai Chi. It's very often on commercials for, medication. I see this all the time. Elderly people doing Tai Chi. Tai Chi. There it is. So what's Tai Chi? That's exactly what you're seeing there. And it's one of these, it's kind of like almost a cross between martial arts and ballet, I guess I would say, right? And it's the sort of thing that old people, my parents adopted it when they were older. They kind of started doing it with a group of seniors in their retirement community. And you go out basically to a park and you do these very kind of slow but very methodical sort of motions with your arms, and you shift your balance. And boy, doctors love this. Doctors will tell old people, like, this is one of the best things you can do. Don't worry, do something for your heart and your lungs, but don't worry about going to the gym. Just walk a lot and do Tai Chi or do yoga. Just having control over your body like that and shifting your balance is so good for old people. The thing about Tai Chi, it's interesting. when they tell people to do the movements, they're actually using their hands in a very idiosyncratic way. You don't actually touch things very much with your hands. It's not like, you know, other exercises you might do where you're stretching out like this or, you know, something like that, right? You're not touching things with your fingers very much at all, okay? But you're concentrating on your fingers and how your fingers are moving. Right. In fact, my parents told me what their instructor said is like, imagine like there's light beams coming out of your fingers, and you're kind of using those light beams to paint smoothly across everything you see in front of you. Okay, and then stop very smoothly, and now go the other way and use your other hand to do that. So there's this constant kind of like thinking about the fingers, thinking about the fingertips, even though there's no real stimulation going on the fingertips. But what you find is that kind of constant mental concentration on the fingertips actually induces some changes in touch sensitivity. So, you know, if you're doing Tai Chi versus something else that doesn't involve that concentration on the fingertips, you don't increase your touch sensitivity to the same degree. And again, it's going to be tested like with something like this, you know, these 2-point things that we were talking about before. These 2-point things we were talking about that's done with the elderly. You find that their touch sensitivity on their fingers improves by concentrating on their fingers, which is really cool. They're not actually touching things with their fingers. They're thinking about, you know, how their fingers are kind of, you know, kind of painting or emanating light or something like that. And that enhances the sensitivity. It's very cool. Another example of how your sensitivity of touch can change based on how you think. And then there's other great examples of this where you can do it in the lab and you can do it spontaneously. So these are experiments. Oh boy, I should have brought it. Okay, let's. What do I have here? Oh, this isn't a bad thing. Yeah, this is a great thing. Okay, this is it's a little canoe paddle. It looks like from a Lego set or something like that. Perfect. So this is a little apparatus, and you can see it here on the bottom of the image, where somebody is putting their fingers across a row of holes. So let's see, you can see it a little bit better there. They have their 4 fingers on a row of holes. And underneath this row of holes, there are basically there's 4 or multiple little things like this, these little kind of rubber paddle things that stroke the fingers in different ways. Okay, they go this way, this way, this way, this way. And they're set up to be patterns. So, you know, I guess they're on some sort of conveyor belt or they're controlled by a computer. And the pattern across the 4 fingers can change. So maybe in this particular pattern, it goes index finger, ring finger, pinky, middle finger. And what they have to do, the subjects would have to do is report that pattern. You know, they say, whenever you get a pattern that's the same twice in a row, say, index, ring, pinky, middle, index, ring, pinky, middle. They have to concentrate on that, and they push a button whenever they get 2 in a row. The next one's something different. Middle, pinky, index, ring. So it's that type of thing. They have to it's a very simple thing, but they have to concentrate on what's going on. That's one group of subjects. They concentrate on the pattern across the fingers. The other group of subjects gets the exact same sort of pattern on their fingers, but they're asked to report something else. They're asked to report whether, how does this work? Whether the pattern on one finger is the same or different. Okay, so now don't worry about this pattern, this new group of subjects. Don't worry about this pattern across the fingers. Just concentrate on your ring finger and tell us when there's a pattern that's the same. It's the same type of thing, but just concentrate on one finger. Ignore all these other things. And if you get like this, 1, 2, and then you get another one, 1, 2, push a button if it's the same. If you get this, 1, and then this, 1, 2, don't push a button because it's not the same. So it's the exact same stimulation in both cases, but the 2 groups of subjects are concentrating on 2 different aspects on the stimulation. One's concentrating on the pattern as it exists across all fingers. The other group is concentrating on the pattern as it exists on just one finger, say their ring finger or something like that. And depending on which pattern people are concentrating on, whether it's attention to finger touch or attention to the touch across all the fingers, the area of their touch brain will change. Okay, so again, the stimulation is all the same. But if you're just concentrating on the finger, the ring finger, over the period of, say, the 2 hours of the experiment, that concentration will enlarge in your touch-sensitive area of your brain that represents the ring finger. If somebody else is thinking about the touch pattern on just their index finger, it's going to enlarge that. If, on the other hand, they're in that group of subjects that's going to look for patterns across the fingers, all four of their fingers will show an expansion of representation in their brain. That little map area will give a nice big area to all four fingers. Again, everybody in this experiment is getting the exact same touch pattern. They're just concentrating on different aspects of it. And the aspect on which they're concentrating will help determine how the brain is going to kind of reorganize itself to represent, what's important in that case. Okay, is that it? Yeah, for that slide? Good. Okay, let's go through one more slide having to do with plasticity, and this is going to have some obvious relevance. This has to do with amputation. And I knew this was an important part, now had become an important part of the plasticity story, the touch plasticity story. And I had a chance to meet this wonderful guy who is very forthcoming and introspective and honest about what he was experiencing after he had had an amputation. So I met him about, I think, 2 weeks after the amputation, as I remember. It says in the book how long it was. But his name was Ben Curry, lovely guy. And he had just had his left leg amputated below his knee. It was because of the outcome of severe diabetes. He didn't have, the diabetes made it difficult for him to feel very much of what was going on in his lower leg. And he got a serious infection, and sadly the only way they could treat it was to do an amputation in order to, basically save his life. It was devastating. It is a devastating thing to have to go through, even though deep down, better this happened than I lose my life. Losing a limb is very, very traumatic. There's no question about it. So I talked to him about it, and he was very honest, and he said, it was a very, emotionally traumatic thing to go through. I'm still recovering from it, he said. He had lost his mother and his brother, and he said, this is of that level of trauma and grief. It really is. But he knew I wanted to talk to him also about this issue of whether or not he felt anything like sensation in the limb that he had lost. And you've probably heard of this idea. It's called phantom pain. And he said, yes, I do. I feel pain in a toe that is no longer there. It's a toe that was in the foot that was taken. And sometimes it can be pain to the point of being uncomfortable. And he said that, I'll look down at it. I know that there's no toe there, but it really does feel like there's pain there. Sometimes I'll bend down and kind of rub it to make it feel better. And he said that it started, actually, I might have talked to him after a month or something like that, because he said that this happened not right away after the amputation. It happened about 2 weeks after the amputation that he started to feel pain there. And he says that he knows a little bit about what's going on. Fortunately, I'll tell you about it too. But he knows that he will sometimes find himself going down to rub the foot that's no longer there. And he'll say that what he's doing in that case is I'm patronizing my brain. I'm kind of helping my brain kind of get over the kind of the way it feels sensations in a part of my body that used to be there. He says, I patronize my brain in that way. I think it's a kind of very insightful thing for him to say. I think that's exactly what's going on. And what's going on, it probably has a lot to do with neuroplasticity, the sort of plasticity we've been discussing. So a couple of things I want to tell you before we do that, before we get into some of the mechanics of this, is that phantom pain, I can't remember what the percentage is, 20, 30% of people that have amputation maybe have phantom pain, but I didn't know this until I started looking into this literature. The idea that you still have some sensation in a limb that's been taken is very, very common. 90% of amputees have phantom sensation in the limb that's been taken. Now, it's not necessarily pain, fortunately, for more than half of them, it's not a painful thing. They might feel a tingling, they might feel like somebody is touching, say, their toe that's no longer there, but almost everybody, 9 out of 10 folks, has some sort of sensation in the part of their body that's been taken, okay? Now, when I was a kid, I remember, there'd be shows on this, and I remember talking to my parents about this sort of thing because they dealt with the deaf and blind individuals, and sometimes they would, come back from war or something like that, and they'd also have amputations, and they would talk about phantom pain sometimes. And back then, they really didn't know what was going on. And what they would say is, well, maybe when they removed the limb, they would have some sort of nerve damage at the stump. So sometimes when people had really uncomfortable phantom pain, what they would do is send them back to surgery and do a little bit more surgery on the stump to see if they could maybe change the way the nerves were cut or whatever. And sometimes I guess that helped. More often than not, it didn't, but they would always be willing to try something. And I remember, the very prominent theory about what was going on back then is it was a way of kind of the person dealing with the trauma, the grief of losing a limb. And this is one of the ways that it came out. It came in this kind of phantom pain, phantom sensation sort of way. And it was something to do with the emotional trauma. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to take anything away from these people. These people are really going through grief. They really are going through like a loss. But it might make it more kind of noticeable, the phantom pain or phantom sensation. But I think these days we know it's not the full basis. The full basis really has more to do with neuroplasticity. Because what we believe happens when somebody loses a limb is the areas of their brain that used to be dedicated to that part of the body, okay, kind of try to reorganize themselves. And that reorganization can have some pretty negative side effects. So, we've been talking about neuroplasticity as being something that's positive. That's something that you can learn. Experience helps. It can allow for kind of cross-sensory compensation to happen in the blind and the deaf and stuff. And we've talked about the positives of neuroplasticity. But here, neuroplasticity can sometimes have this sort of more negative effect where, a limb is taken away and the brain's saying, I don't know what to do, and starts reorganizing. And sometimes that reorganization will cause the problem. In fact, we don't know, last time I looked at this literature, I'm not sure they know exactly what aspects of the kind of tremendous amount of neuroplasticity of the shifting causes the pain and the sensation. But what they do know is the more they see the reorganization occurring, the more pain somebody is likely to have. So for someone like Ben, what they did here, let me see here what we have. He lost this part. Is this the lower leg right here? He lost this part here, and this part of the brain that represented the lower leg, in fact, started really trying to reorganize itself and dedicate itself to another part of the body or something like that. And for Ben, there was a lot of it. For other people, there isn't necessarily as much, and it's unclear why. There's more in some people than other people. That's not quite clear. But if you see a lot of reorganization, it's likely that the person is going to have more pain. Now, this is something, it's nice, I think. I think it's a good thing now, especially for Ben. Ben was taught this. I mean, it was great. Ben went through a whole little course his doctor helped him, and he did an online course about phantom pain and phantom sensation. And he said, you know, it was reassuring to him to know that it wasn't related to his you know, emotional trauma, but this is something the brain does. The brain just, you know, doesn't know what to do after an amputation. And so, you know, he says, I will patronize my brain. I'm going to help my brain to try to figure out what's going on. And it kind of relieved the stress of thinking that, you know, it was his emotional reactions that were causing this, because it wasn't. It was neuroplasticity that was causing it. The other things that we know, I should probably look back at this literature now. It's been a while. But the other things we knew back in the early 2010, 2015 time is that it depended on the part of the body that took over. So this is what I mean here. Let me show you here. All right, so if you can see here what goes on, the way things mapped out here. So here's the knee, here's the toes, and the lower leg, okay? The lower leg is removed below the knee, say, and what you're gonna find is that right next to that area, the way the brain is mapped out here, the body is mapped out on the brain, is the knee, and the upper leg could take over for this. And if that's the case, if it kind of moves in here and say, now we're going to use this part of the vacated brain to represent the sensations of knees and upper legs, it's less likely to cause a lot of pain. Okay, so in Ben's case, it was a kind of a drastic shifting. Everything kind of shifted over, and it was a lot of neuroplasticity. However, if it's more subtle neuroplasticity, the fact that the knee is close to the lower leg, and that's now the part of the body that is being represented here, that's a more positive thing. What you find often, though, is if somebody loses a hand, and then look at the parts of the body that could take over for it. The arm could take over for what's left here, or the face could take over for what's left here. If the arm takes over, because that's a part of the body that is close to the part that was lost, there'll likely be less pain. If, on the other hand, the face takes over, okay, the hand's gone, there's a vacated part of this little map here, the face takes over here, okay, that's going to induce more pain. The patient's going to be more likely to have phantom limb pain if the face takes over rather than the arm take over. And the idea here is what they've learned is the more kind of distant the body part is that's taking over for the removed part, the more pain the patient's likely going to have. So let's go back to the hand and the face versus the arm. Okay, the arm is very close to the hand. If the hand is removed and the arm takes over from that vacated space, because those parts are close on the body, there's going to be less pain. If, on the other hand, the hand is removed and the face takes over from that area that's now been vacated, because the face and hand are further apart on the body, there's going to be more pain. So that's something else we know. So, you know, I don't know if they know a lot more about the exact relationship between neuroplasticity and phantom sensation and phantom pain, but they do know that it's clearly related. In fact, the idea of patronizing the brain, the idea that Ben Curry, this insight he has, is something that they've actually, you know, put into therapeutic techniques. So, as an example, and that's what this is showing down here in the lower right, there are new treatments that involve things like mirrors and virtual reality. If phantom pain is bad enough, there are ways of treating it through these sorts of techniques. So here, imagine how this would work. And I actually don't think this is, this is somebody just demonstrating it. This is not an amputee, I bet. Yeah. But imagine he was amputated. Imagine he didn't have his left hand. Okay, so he had lost his left hand, and he found that there was a lot of pain there. A lot of pain in his left hand, maybe because of, as I said, that maybe the face took over that area or something like that. But the pain's in the hand, and you know what you often find with people that have phantom pain in their hands is they feel like almost like their fist is clenching, even though there's no fist there. They feel like there's tension in the hand almost, more than like there's an actual, like a shooting pain in a finger or something like that. They'll feel there's tension in their hand. And so what they'll have people do is they'll have them use this mirror box. Well, they'll put their right hand in the right side, their intact right hand in the right side, and look at its reflection as if they're looking at their left hand. They'll also put the remaining part of their left arm into the box. But there'll be no left hand here. This is showing a real left hand, but for an amputee, obviously it wouldn't be there. But they'll look then at their right hand and slowly kind of clench it and unclench it and see their left hand doing that, clenching and unclenching. Kind of, it's an illusion, right? Because it's a mirror box. But they will see, potentially, they'll be almost convinced that they're seeing their left hand clenching and unclenching. And in doing that, it seems to at least temporarily relieve the pain and the tightness in the hand that's been removed, which is really interesting. Now, last I looked, that seemed to be effective for certain types of amputations to relieve phantom pain, phantom sensation to some degree, but it was something that needed to be done repeatedly. It wasn't, it would work for a few days and then the pain would come back. It wasn't like a long-term sort of solution. It was something that they would have to do every few weeks or every few days even. Okay, but the good news is that we now know that the phantom sensation is something, the phantom pain is something that comes from neuroplasticity. So the more we learn about how neuroplasticity works, the more we'll be able to help these people with what they're going through. Okay, let me take a little stop here and see if there are questions. Looks like there are a couple. What we got here? William asks, what decides if the arm or face takes over? Very good question in the map. That's a great question, William. And I was just thinking of that as I went through, if I remember reading about that. There might be something in the book, but I don't think there is. And I don't necessarily know if it's 50-50. It could be that the arm takes over more often. But I don't know for certain. You could imagine there might be ways of kind of facilitating one or the other taking over somehow. So maybe, if you were being trained to, do a, you're going to like this, doing a 2-point discrimination on the face, maybe that would, cause the face to take over, but you wouldn't want to do that. You want the arm to take over. So you do, okay, let's try to get the arm, let's try to do some sort of new skill where the arm sensitivity has to be increased so the arm takes over more readily. So maybe there's ways that you can actually set up a kind of a therapeutic kind of rehabilitation system where you can kind of nudge the arm to take over that space rather than the face to take over that space. But I don't know offhand what causes one or the other. I don't know. I don't remember. It's a great question. Other questions about neuroplasticity having to do with amputations or anything like that? Anything? Okay, let's do one more polling question quick. I know there's a lot of material today. It's very technical, so it's okay, we do this. Yeah, let's do phantom pain. You got it. Phantom pain question. You should have no problem with this one. So the question is, what proportion of amputees have some type of phantom sensation? Some type of phantom sensation, okay? And you shouldn't have a problem doing this. So is it less than 10%? Is it less than a third, less than a half? Or is it 90% or more that have phantom sensation? You should know this very easily from the last slide. You can just look back on the last slide if you want. Yeah, you're all getting it. Too easy, but now you have a question at least. Okay, another few seconds. Looks like most of you got in this. Okay, I think we got it. All right, I'm going to end the poll and let you know that most of you did get this correct. When it comes to the sensation, it is about 90%. So this isn't phantom pain. Fortunately, fewer people have true phantom pain. But phantom sensation, which could be like a tingling, or maybe you've lost your toe, your lower leg's been cut off, and you might feel somebody like touching your toe, or somebody tickling or something like that. 90% of people have that. That was absolutely news to me. I had no idea it was that high a proportion of people with amputations had the sensation. Fortunately, again, the pain is much less common. I think it's 10, 20%, something like that. But most people do have this sensation, just some type of sensation. And it might change over the rest of their life. They might feel less of it, but at least in the beginning, most people will feel something like that. Okay? So take a picture of that if you haven't yet. And let's go ahead and finish off today's discussion. We're going to switch topics now a little bit. And we're going to continue talking about touch, but we're going to talk about a different type of touch. So let's quit this and go to something you've learned a little bit about, actually. A second. I will share the screen, which is the Tadoma technique of speech perception. I believe Serena asked you to watch a film and post a link to the film, hopefully. If not, I will remind her to do that. But that film was about Helen Keller. And that is the material you'll be responsible for on the final. So make sure if you haven't watched that yet, that you do watch it. Let me just see. There was a question here all of a sudden that popped up. I just want to see if that is about the film. Let me take a quick look. Yes, it was about Helen Keller. Thank you very much, Ralph. That confirms it. Good. Yes. Make sure you do watch that if you haven't watched it yet. It is going to be part of the final material, and I think you'll find it really interesting. She really was an amazing woman. But I want to tell you about somebody I met who was also an amazing guy. He's sadly passed away since the book was written. I think he passed away a couple of years ago. His name's Rick Joy. His name was Rick Joy. And there you see him there. He's the one on the right. He is, in fact, deaf and blind, and had been deaf and blind since he was 2 years old. It was meningitis, I believe. Both his deafness and blindness came from meningitis. There aren't as many deaf and blind people as there used to be. We'll talk about that in a second, but there was a lot more back in his day when he was a kid, and a lot of that came from a disease called rubella. I don't know if you've heard of that disease. Hopefully you don't know very much about it because you don't need to. However, I will say this. The vaccine, MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella, that has been somewhat controversial, and people have been withholding from their children, and that's been bringing back measles. It also could bring back rubella if enough people fail to vaccinate their kids, and rubella is a much more serious disease and was the most common reason for people being deaf and blind back in the 50s and 60s when Rick Joy was born. Anyway, on to better subjects. Rick was an amazing guy, and I spent 2 hours with him. He interviewed me I interviewed him, and he understood my questions by touching my face, which we'll talk about in just a second. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about Rick. He, received a college degree. He was an Eagle Scout. He was the first blind deaf Eagle Scout in the world, and it's a very intensive sort of program. It's like the top of the Boy Scouts become Eagle Scouts, and so he was very active lifestyle. He used to swim regularly, jog regularly with friends that would help him, of course. Got a college degree, worked for Hewlett Packard for 30 years, designing circuit boards. He was married with a child, adorable kid, and who was hearing. His wife was deaf, but the child was hearing and seeing. Really just an amazing guy. He used to do home renovations on his house. He used to get on the roof of his house, he'd tell me, and people would come over and tell his wife, "Do you realize that your blind and deaf husband is doing construction on the top of his house?" And they say, "Oh yes, he likes that type of thing." And he kind of, put all the tiles back on the roof of his house, and he made patio in the backyard for himself. I mean, he's just a really, really resourceful guy. He was he showed me one of his favorite hobbies was amateur radio, and I don't know if you're familiar with amateur radio, but oh, I got to stop now. Okay, I'll talk about this next class, but I want to tell you a little bit about some of the various ways he's learned to compensate for not being able to see or hear anything. Okay, we'll talk about that in next class.